Mr. Commissioner, today the Commission is presenting its next overview report dealing with fundraising in support of protesters. Next slide, please. COM OR 705 describes the major fundraising activities that took place to provide money to support protesters in Ottawa. This overview report describes a variety of entities that were involved in this process, including crowdfunding platforms, financial institutions, payment processors, as well as cryptocurrencies. The report provides a narrative of meetings and decision-making that took place with respect to how these fundraisers would be organized, constructed, and how money would be distributed. And it provides information available to the Commission about the ultimate sources and disposition of approximately $24 million in donations. Next slide. Before getting into the results of the investigation, a few words about the process that the Commission used. It began by reviewing information provided by the parties to the proceeding. However, a great deal of the information necessary to complete this investigation was not in the hands of the parties. The Commission, using its powers of summons as well as negotiations, obtained additional documents from 6 non-parties to this proceeding, as well as engaging in an open source investigation for further information. Commission counsel also interviewed 10 witnesses who provided statements that then were used to complete this report. Next slide, please. There were certainly a number of fundraisers that were in play during the Ottawa protests. This overview report focuses, however, on 4 main sources of funding. The GoFundMe and email money transfer campaigns associated with the Freedom Convoy, the Adopt a Trucker crowdfunding and email money transfer campaign, the second Freedom Convoy fundraiser hosted on the GiveSendGo platform, and a subset of cryptocurrency campaigns that raised virtual currencies in support of protesters. Next slide. This represents the results of the investigation. Each line depicts a different source of funds and tracks how those funds were distributed and how they were dealt with at various points by a number of different intermediaries. The thickness of each line represents the amount of funding in question. I'll return to this slide towards the end of my presentation to review exactly what the Commission learned about the sources and final destinations of funds. Next slide, please. Before turning to that, however, it's useful to review some of the individuals and entities that played significant roles in the fundraising associated with the Freedom Convoy. Some of those individuals include Tamara Leach, who was the creator of the original GoFundMe and email money transfer campaigns for the Freedom Convoy, Chris Guerra, the organizer of the Adopt a Trucker campaign and its associated fundraisers, Chad Eros, an accountant who provided advice to the Freedom Convoy organizers, created the Convoy Corporation, and played a significant role in the creation of the GiveSendGo campaign, and Jacob Wells, the co-founder of GiveSendGo, who was also involved in the move of the Freedom Convoy crowdfunding campaign to his platform. Next slide, please. There are also a number of companies that were involved in the various forms of fundraising. You have already heard me refer to GoFundMe and GiveSendGo, which are 2 crowdfunding platforms that take in donations in support of causes. There are also Canadian financial institutions that had important roles, such as the Toronto Dominion Bank and the Royal Bank of Canada. These were 2 financial institutions that received some of the funds. And finally, payment processors like Stripe and its Canadian subsidiary, Stripe Payment Canada Limited, played an important role in the background to these fundraisers, as I will discuss later in my presentation and is set out in more detail in the overview report. Next slide, please. One thing that will become apparent as one reviews the overview report is that frequently there were events that were taking place in parallel. It is not a strictly linear story that can be told, but rather one has to understand that different actors were engaged in different forms of fundraising conduct at the same time. The first part of the story that the overview report details has to do with the period January 14 to February 2nd of 2022, associated with the creation of the Freedom Convoy GoFundMe campaign and its associated e-transfer campaign. Next slide, please. The story begins with Tamara Leach and the creation of a crowdfunding campaign on the GoFundMe platform on January 14th of 2022. At the same time, or rather 4 days later, Ms. Leach also made a post to Facebook that put forward an email address that solicited direct email money transfer donations in support of the Freedom Convoy. Both the GiveSendGo campaign and the email money transfer campaign were associated with a bank account at the Toronto Dominion Bank in Ms. Leach's name. And both campaigns began to receive funds on the days that they were created. Next slide, please. In its interview with Commission Counsel, representatives from GoFundMe indicated that they became aware of the crowdfunding campaign on their platform within hours of its creation. This was because it was flagged through its algorithms due to the very high rate of donations that were made very early in its creation. This flagging caused individuals within GoFundMe to review the campaign. And relatively early on, those individuals began to be concerned about the ability of this fundraiser to comply with the GoFundMe terms of service. In particular, the concern related to the GoFundMe terms related to campaigns distributing money in accordance with their description. When an individual creates a crowdfunding campaign, they have to describe what it is that they're going to do with the money that's raised. GoFundMe requires people who organize campaigns on their platform to actually distribute money in accordance with what they tell the public they will do with it. In the case of the Freedom Convoy fundraiser, the description said that it would do certain things with the money, such as, we are asking for donations to help with the costs of fuel, food, and lodgings. Funds will be spent to help cover the costs of fuel for our truckers first and foremost, will be used to assist with food if needed, and contribute to shelter if needed. Any leftover donations will be donated to a credible veterans organization, which will be chosen by the donors. GoFundMe reported that it had concerns with these statements. They indicated that, for example, they were uncertain how it would be possible for what was now thousands of donors to all agree on a credible veterans organization that could receive leftover funds. Because of these initial concerns, they tasked what they called their VIP team to reach out to Ms. Leach. This is a group of GoFundMe employees who are responsible for dealing with high-profile fundraisers. And they reached out to Ms. Leach starting on January 16th of 2022 to discuss the fundraiser and how the funds might be spent. Next slide, please. These communications continued between the 16th and January 27th, initially with Ms. Leach, but very quickly turned over to a group of other individuals who were working with her to manage the campaign and to deal with GoFundMe. Over the course of this period, GoFundMe representatives posed questions and received answers. And by January 27th, they had reached the point where they felt comfortable releasing at least some of the money that had been raised. Up until this point, donations remained in the control of GoFundMe. On January 27th, in order to formalize the assurances that Ms. Leach and her associates had provided GoFundMe, they provided something that they refer to as the attestation letter. The attestation letter was a document that they asked Ms. Leach to sign that set out a number of obligations on her part that she would have to agree to in exchange for access to the first $1 million of funds. This included pledges that she would act as a fiduciary for the beneficiaries of the fundraiser, that is to say, the truckers involved in the Ottawa protests, that she would deliver funds in a manner that was consistent with what she had set out in the fundraiser itself, a series of accountability mechanisms, such as requiring truckers to sign registration forms and to provide receipts in order to receive reimbursement, and to make reimbursements through email money transfers to create a form of a digital paper trail that could be tracked. Finally, there was a requirement for the group of advisors that had surrounded her on these matters to form a formal finance committee that would be involved in overseeing the distribution of funds. Ms. Leach signed the attestation letter on January 27th and returned it to GoFundMe. Next slide. It is at this point that GoFundMe decided to release $1 million Canadian to Ms. Leach's bank account. However, the money did not actually get transmitted on January 27th, and this led to some confusion amongst various actors. As the Commission discovered, while GoFundMe had reached the decision to release the funds on January 27th, it wasn't until February 1st that an actual transaction was initiated. In the time between January 27th and February 1st, Chad Eros, the accountant who by this point had been brought in by the organizers to assist them in their dealing with GoFundMe, began to express concerns about the idea that funds would be sent directly to Ms. Leach's personal bank account. In his view, it would be more appropriate for there to be a nonprofit corporation that would receive donated funds and would manage their distribution. To that end, on January 30th, again, after the money was agreed to be released, but before any release of funds took place, Mr. Eros incorporated the Freedom 2022 Human Rights and Freedoms Nonprofit Corporation, which is referred to in the overview report as the Convoy Corporation. As I've mentioned, February 1st was the date in which the actual fund transfer from GoFundMe was initiated. Records obtained from Toronto Dominion Bank indicate that on that date, Chris Barber was added as a second signatory to Ms. Leach's account that was receiving the funds. Records also showed that a second account at TD Bank was opened jointly between Ms. Leach and Mr. Barber on that date. The overview report refers to these as the first and the second TD accounts, respectively. February 2nd, in the early morning hours, was when the $1 million was in fact deposited into the first TD account. However, for reasons that I'm going to get into later in my presentation, very little of that money was ever accessed. And on February 3rd, TD Bank itself placed holds on both the first and the second TD account. Next slide, please. Before continuing the story of the GoFundMe fundraiser, I'm going to speak a little bit about a second fundraiser that was taking place during the same period of time, the Adopt a Trucker fundraiser on the GiveSendGo platform. Next slide, please. Chris Guerra articulated the concept of Adopt a Trucker on Facebook. The idea was to pair Ottawa area residents with incoming truckers so that the truckers could receive support like showers, food, and billets. In order to support this concept, Mr. Guerra created a crowdfunding campaign on January 18th on GiveSendGo. This campaign was attached to a bank account in his name located at the Royal Bank of Canada. Sometime after the creation of that crowdfunding campaign, he also, with the assistance of a man known to the Commission as Serge, created a website. The website did a number of different things, including soliciting email money transfer donations. Those donations were associated with an email address that was also connected to the same RBC account. And again, on January 18th, these campaigns began to raise funds. Next slide, please. So I'm going to return now to the GoFundMe campaign and discuss the events that took place that eventually led to that campaign being shut down. Next slide. Now, I've already indicated that on January 27th, GoFundMe had authorized the release of $1 million in funds. We'll recall that January 28th was the first day in which protesters, as part of the Freedom Convoy, began to arrive in Ottawa. GoFundMe representatives told the Commission that on January 28th, they began to receive conflicting media reports about the nature of the protests that were taking place. They were aware of some media reports that described the protests as peaceful, and other reports that described it as involving harassment or unlawful activities. This led GoFundMe to have concerns about terms of service compliance, not only with respect to whether the funds would be distributed in accordance with the description, but also their requirement that funds not be used to fund unlawful conduct. A series of further communications between GoFundMe and convoy organizers then took place. On January 31st, GoFundMe sent emails to organizers asking a series of questions, and in particular asking them to confirm that no funds would be given to protesters that were engaged in a range of unlawful activities. One of the activities specifically mentioned by GoFundMe in their communications was blockades of roads. Subsequently, on February 1st, the day in which the $1 million transaction was actually initiated, GoFundMe emailed organizers asking a further series of questions, including whether or not they would agree to publicly disavow unlawful conduct that GoFundMe was concerned may be taking place in Ottawa. GoFundMe asked the organizers to respond to their questions within 24 hours. A response was not received within that time frame, and on February 2nd, the same day that $1 million was received into the first TD account, GoFundMe decided to suspend the fundraiser pending further investigation. Over the course of the next 2 days, a series of important meetings took place. On February 2nd, representatives of GoFundMe met with Deputy Chief Bell of the Ottawa Police Service, and on February 3rd, with Mayor Watson of the City of Ottawa. On February 3rd, the Freedom Convoy organizers also had a series of communications with GoFundMe. A letter drafted by Keith Wilson, acting as counsel for the Convoy Corporation, was sent responding to the questions posed in GoFundMe's February 1st email. Subsequently, a telephone conversation took place involving Mr. Wilson, Mr. Eros, other associates of the fundraisers, and the GoFundMe platform. In their interview with Commission counsel, GoFundMe representatives indicated that they left that meeting unsatisfied with the responses that they had received, and they continued to have concerns about the lawfulness of the protests and the role that the funds might play in those protests. On February 4th, GoFundMe had a second meeting with Deputy Chief Bell. It was also on that date that representatives of GoFundMe reported that they believed that individuals associated with the Freedom Convoy leadership were using social media to encourage harassment of GoFundMe employees. GoFundMe reported that its employees had received a number of threats after the decision was made to suspend the fundraising campaign, and those threats increased in frequency on February 4th. In the evening of February 4th, GoFundMe made the decision to cancel the fundraiser, and over the course of the next 24 hours, arrived at the conclusion that they ought to refund all donations made to the platform. Next slide, please. The overview report also describes the events that took place surrounding the move of the Freedom Convoy fundraiser from the GoFundMe platform to the GiveSendGo platform. But as I mentioned before, often events were taking place in parallel. And as it turned out, there were critical events involved in that move to GiveSendGo that were taking place as early as January 26th, even before Ms. Leach had signed the attestation letter, let alone the GoFundMe campaign being shut down. Next slide, please. In order to understand this part of the story, there are some additional individuals who have to be introduced. On January 26th, a man named John Ballard reached out to Jacob Wells, the co-founder of GiveSendGo. Mr. Ballard is understood by the Commission to be associated with an American-based social media platform called CloutHub. In the January 26th meeting, Mr. Ballard spoke to Mr. Wells about the possibility of the two men working together to convince the Freedom Convoy organizers to move their crowdfunding campaign off of GoFundMe and onto GiveSendGo. In furtherance of this discussion, on January 27th, Mr. Wells created what he described to the Commission as a mock-up of a campaign on his platform, showing what a Freedom Convoy fundraiser would look like on GiveSendGo. Although, to be clear, this was not an active campaign and was not capable of receiving funds. On January 28th, Mr. Ballard obtained Mr. Eros's contact information by way of Mr. Guerra. Mr. Ballard contacted Mr. Eros and asked him to join a phone conversation to discuss the possibility of the Freedom Convoy raising funds on GiveSendGo. Mr. Eros agreed to join that conversation. However, before that phone call took place, Mr. Eros reports receiving a phone call from another man named James Peloso, who is associated with the organization Taking Back Our Freedoms. Mr. Eros and Mr. Peloso had not previously had interactions with each other. Mr. Peloso indicated that he should be involved in any phone call involving GiveSendGo because Taking Back Our Freedoms had funders who would not agree to fund the Freedom Convoy unless one of their individuals was on the inside for discussions related to fundraising activities. On January 31st, a meeting took place between Mr. Eros, Mr. Wells, Mr. Peloso, Mr. Ballard, and another individual named Jeff Brain, who is the founder of CloutHub. During that meeting, Mr. Ballard described a plan to move the Freedom Convoy off of GoFundMe and onto GiveSendGo. As part of this plan, he also suggested that Freedom Convoy organizers should use CloutHub as their main web presence to advertise their campaign and indeed their movement as a whole. Mr. Ballard also described how CloutHub would provide a secure means of communication between organizers of the Freedom Convoy. Mr. Brain, again the founder of CloutHub, also offered to provide Freedom Convoy organizers a $250,000 loan to finance their operations, pending the ability for them to access donated funds. At the end of this meeting, no decision was made with respect to taking CloutHub up on its offer to use its services or indeed to accept a loan from them. Indeed, Mr. Wells and Mr. Eros in their interviews with the Commission found it confusing that CloutHub was involved in these meetings at all. However, as a result of this meeting, Mr. Eros and Mr. Wells did form a connection, and as a result of that connection, an agreement was made to create a crowdfunding campaign on GiveSendGo connected to the Convoy Corporation. That campaign was created and went live on January 31st, again, prior to the release of funds the next day from the GoFundMe campaign. Ultimately, when the GoFundMe campaign was shut down, Ms. Leach advertised the fact that the GiveSendGo campaign was in existence, and funders then moved and made donations there. Next slide, please. I mentioned before that payment processors played an important role in the story of the fundraising of the Freedom Convoy. This was a role that was played largely behind the scenes, and it had the most significance when it came to the GiveSendGo campaign. To the public, there was only ever one campaign on GiveSendGo associated with the Freedom Convoy fundraiser. However, for reasons connected with how Stripe operates, there were in effect two campaigns associated with the Freedom Convoy fundraiser on GiveSendGo. And in order to understand why that came to be, one has to understand a little bit about what payment processors are and how they operate. Most crowdfunding platforms don't actually accept and distribute funds themselves. They are, in effect, kind of a social network shell that provides a platform to attract donors. The actual work of receiving electronic donations and distributing those donations to bank accounts are done by payment processors like Stripe. On the GiveSendGo campaign, in order to set up a campaign at all, one needs to have a Stripe account. However, in order to create a Stripe account, an individual has to have a bank account to associate with it. This presented a unique difficulty for Mr. Eros, because at this point, the Convoy Corporation did not have a bank account. Recall that the Convoy Corporation was only created the day before, on January 30th. He therefore could not create a Stripe account and therefore could not attach it to the GiveSendGo campaign. As a temporary solution to this problem, Mr. Wells suggested that he use his Stripe account, attach it to the campaign on GiveSendGo, and that is what happened. And so between January 31st, when the campaign first went live, and February 7th, the GiveSendGo campaign was actually attached to Mr. Wells' Stripe account, and through that, his personal bank account. On February 7th, Mr. Eros did create a Stripe account. However, that account was not connected to the Convoy Corporation directly. By February 7th, the corporation still did not have a bank account. In order for Mr. Eros to create a Stripe account, he reached an agreement with Keith Wilson to have the Stripe account attached to Mr. Wilson's trust account at his law firm. Once this took place, on February 7th, the fundraiser was switched over from Mr. Wells' Stripe account to Mr. Eros's Stripe account. And from February 7th until February 10th or 11th, the evidence on that point is conflicting, donations made to the GiveSendGo campaign went into Mr. Eros's Stripe account. On either February 10th or 11th, the Stripe account was switched back to Mr. Wells' Stripe account, and all further donations made to the GiveSendGo campaign went there. Next slide, please. I'll return to the crowdfunding campaigns in a moment, but before I do, a few words about some of the activities involving cryptocurrencies that were taking place. The majority of these activities occurred between January 27th and February 17th of 2022. Next slide. There were a number of cryptocurrency campaigns and fundraisers taking place during the Freedom Convoy. This overview report focuses on three main ones. The first was a cryptocurrency campaign associated with Mr. Guerra's Adopt a Trucker campaign. I mentioned before that an individual named Serge created a website for Adopt a Trucker. In addition to soliciting email money transfers, that website also provided information that would allow individuals to donate any of 6 different types of cryptocurrencies to the Adopt a Trucker campaign. However, it appears that those cryptocurrencies were not in the control of Mr. Guerra directly, but were rather controlled by Serge. A second different type of cryptocurrency campaign took place in association with Pat King. This was the Freedom Convoy token campaign, a new cryptocurrency that was created and marketed in association with the Freedom Convoy. The idea behind this campaign was that individuals would exchange pre-existing cryptocurrencies for this new cryptocurrency called Freedom Convoy token. Built into Freedom Convoy token was a process by which 4% of every transaction involving it would be diverted to an entity called the Freedom Convoy Foundation. The idea being that this would provide a long-term source of funds for convoy protesters. However, the Commission was unable to determine whether or not such an entity even exists, and it appears that there is not an active market today for Freedom Convoy token, and therefore funds are not flowing to any such entity. The most significant cryptocurrency campaign addressed in the overview report was the Honk Honk HODL campaign. Next slide, please. This campaign was started by an Ottawa area resident named Nicholas St. Louis on or about January 27th. While Mr. St. Louis was the creator of the campaign, there were a number of individuals that were associated with it at different stages, including Benjamin Dichter. Using a cryptocurrency crowdfunding platform called Tallycoin, this campaign ultimately raised approximately 22 Bitcoin in donations. The value of those 22 Bitcoin at the time was approximately $1.2 million Canadian, although today the value would be significantly lower. Of that money, approximately $800,000 was distributed to protesters involved in the Ottawa protests. This was done by splitting $800,000 worth of Bitcoin into 100 individual electronic wallets, and then handing out in sealed envelopes 100 sets of instructions on how to access one of those unique online wallets. These were distributed to truckers in Ottawa over a 24-hour period on February 16th and 17th of 2022. Next slide, please. We get to the part of the narrative contained in the overview report that deals with how all of the funds we've just been discussed were eventually blocked from arriving in the hands of fundraisers. In order to understand this, it's useful to understand two types of court orders that were involved in the process that led to these funds being blocked. The first is something called a restraint order. This is a type of order that can only be obtained by the Attorney General of a province or of Canada, and it exists within the Criminal Code's proceeds of crime provisions. In essence, a restraint order is obtained by the Attorney General when they are able to show that there are reasonable grounds to believe that some property meets the definition of offense-related property. Offense-related property is defined to mean any property that is used in any manner in connection with an indictable offense or is intended to be so used. The effect of a restraint order is to prohibit anyone from dealing in any way with the property in question unless in accordance with the terms of the order. The second type of order to understand is called a Mareva injunction. A Mareva injunction is a civil court order. It is ordinarily obtained by plaintiffs in civil proceedings against defendants. It is used to freeze and preserve a defendant's assets and funds when there is a risk that they may be dissipated. Its purpose is to freeze those funds in place so that if plaintiffs are successful in their lawsuit, there will be assets that they are able to execute judgment against. Both of these types of orders, restraint orders and Mareva injunctions, played a significant role in how funds that were raised were ultimately disposed of. Next slide. On February 10th, the Attorney General of Ontario applied ex parte to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice and obtained a restraint order against the funds that had been raised on the GiveSendGo platform, those being the Freedom Convoy campaign, as well as the Adopt a Trucker campaign. As a result of the restraint order, Stripe froze the accounts of Mr. Guerra and Mr. Eros. It did not, however, freeze the account of Mr. Wells, as it was held not by Stripe Payment Canada Limited, but by the American payment company Stripe, which Stripe felt was beyond the reach of the Ontario restraint order. I've mentioned before that it is either on February 10th or 11th that Mr. Wells changed over the Stripe account associated with the Freedom Convoy fundraiser from Mr. Eros's frozen Stripe account to his own active Stripe account. Mr. Wells also took action with respect to the Adopt a Trucker campaign. While Mr. Guerra's Stripe account was frozen by the restraint order, Mr. Wells switched that campaign over to a backup payment processor based in the United States called RallyPay. Thus, while both of the fundraising campaigns remained attached to active payment processors and could continue to receive funds, it would be difficult for those funds to arrive in the hands of the organizers. By this point in time, both TD Bank and RBC had been put on notice of the restraint order, and they too were prevented by its terms from dealing in any way with the funds raised on GiveSendGo. On February 17th, Zexi Lee, in her role as the representative plaintiff of a proposed class action of Ottawa residents, obtained a Mareva injunction. This order applied to a broader set of assets. It included those assets covered by the restraint order, but also applied to several other individuals and other assets. For example, it applied to assets that were raised by Mr. King, and it applied to a range of cryptocurrencies that were not the subject of the restraint order. On the same day, the Toronto Dominion Bank applied to court to pay in, through an interpleader, approximately $1.4 million that were in the first and second TD accounts in the joint control of Ms. Leach and Mr. Barber. They did so on the basis that the true owners of those funds were unknown and that the funds should be held by the court until such time as the proper recipients of that money could be determined. The money then stayed in these various bank accounts in various locations, frozen by both the restraint and the Mareva orders. This changed on March 9th, when the Mareva injunction was varied to allow these funds essentially to be pooled in the hands of an escrow agent who would hold them all pending the outcome of the Ottawa litigation. And in the days and weeks that followed, the funds that we have been discussing so far were transferred to the escrow agent, where the Commission understands they remain. Next slide, please. This then takes us then to what the Commission understands about the sources of the various funds and their ultimate destinations. Next slide. During the events in question, there were many public statements and questions raised about the issue of foreign versus domestic funding. And in the order in council creating this commission, this issue is also flagged for the Commission's consideration. As a result of this, the Commission made inquiries with various entities about the sources of funds, both in terms of number of donors and in terms of the value of donations. The result of these inquiries show different patterns for different fundraisers. The simplest are the email money transfer campaigns associated with the Freedom Convoy and Adopt a Trucker. Those campaigns were 100% Canadian in that they relied on the email money transfer system that exists within Canada. All donations to those fundraisers originated, at least immediately, from a Canadian domiciled financial institution. The Freedom Convoy GoFundMe campaign was also largely Canadian in its origin. GoFundMe reported that 86% of donors were based in Canada, and that by value, 89% of donations originated in Canada. The two campaigns on GiveSendGo, however, show a different pattern. Both of those campaigns were largely American-based in terms of where donors were located. Freedom Convoy, 59% of donations originated from the United States, 51% for Adopt a Trucker. However, when measured in terms of the value of donations, the values are slightly different. 55% in terms of the actual dollars donated through Adopt a Trucker originated in Canada. And in terms of the Freedom Convoy campaign, an equal amount of money originated from Canada and the United States at 47% each. The remainder from other countries around the world. Next slide, please. And so we return then to this chart that describes the value of money flowing into and out of a number of different entities. I'll begin with the GoFundMe campaign. The GoFundMe campaign raised in excess of $10 million Canadian. $1 million of that was released to Ms. Leach's Toronto Dominion Bank account. However, the full amount was also refunded to donors. In other words, while GoFundMe released $1 million, it also refunded all donors the full amount of their donations, making up the $1 million shortfall themselves. In addition to the $1 million that was deposited into Ms. Leach's TD account from the GoFundMe fundraiser, she also received $419,416.63 in email money transfer donations. Out of this approximately $1.4 million put into the first and second TD account, only $26,000 was accessed. The remaining $1,393,000 and change was placed ultimately into escrow as part of the Mareva injunction. With respect to Adopt a Trucker, Mr. Guerra raised around $800,000 Canadian on GiveSendGo. Of that amount, approximately $330,000 was released by Stripe into Mr. Guerra's RBC account. The remaining money contained in Mr. Guerra's Stripe account was either ultimately paid into escrow or was the subject of a variety of credit card disputes, chargebacks, or fees by various financial institutions. In addition to the $330,000 that Mr. Guerra received into his RBC account, he also received approximately $31,000 in email money transfer donations. Of this amount, approximately $220,000 was released from Mr. Guerra's RBC account and spent on a variety of things. Approximately $141,000 was paid by RBC from that account into escrow. With respect to the Freedom Convoy campaign on GiveSendGo, it begins to become a little bit difficult to provide precise figures. This is because GiveSendGo was reporting donations in US funds, but that those donations were made over a period of time subject to a number of different exchange rates. What we can say is that GiveSendGo reported receiving approximately $9.8 million US in donations, and that using the February 10th Bank of Canada exchange rate, that would be equal to roughly $12.4 million Canadian. Of this, around $3.75 million was put into Mr. Eros's Stripe account, and the remaining approximately $8.6 million went into Mr. Wells' Stripe account. The money in Mr. Eros's Stripe account was sent into escrow. It was not provided to Mr. Eros or into the trust account of Mr. Wilson. There is a bit of a discrepancy there, which was explained by Stripe being taken up again by credit card chargebacks and a variety of fees. In terms of Mr. Wells' Stripe account, while the Commission did not have access to any banking records associated with this, in communications between Mr. Wells and Stripe that the Commission did review, it appears that all donations made and put into his Stripe account were refunded to donors, with the exception of certain fees that were subtracted, as well as components of those donations that donors had indicated should go directly to GiveSendGo. With respect to the Honk Honk HODL campaign, as I mentioned before, out of approximately $1.2 million of Bitcoin that was raised, 800,000 of that was distributed to protesters. Paid into escrow was 7.57 Bitcoin, which at the time was worth approximately $413,000. Finally, there was a $10,000 bank draft that was also paid into escrow. This money originated from a very brief period of time when the Convoy Corporation did have a bank account at the Steinbach Credit Union. Next slide, please. The overview report contains substantially more detail about these transactions and the events surrounding them. For the parties, the overview report is available in the participant database. And for members of the public, this overview report will soon be published in both English and French on the Commission's website, along with over 100 source documents that provide further detail on the things that I've discussed in my presentation. With that, Mr. Commissioner, I'd ask that COM OR 705 be entered into evidence.
Okay, thank you very much.